Isn't this beautiful? Can you imagine what it's like? What it will be like to go throughout the universe, studying planets and the life on each planet and learning all these things? Ah, what beauty. Today, we're going to study the question, what is measuring time? And I've purposefully put a blurry picture here of the two charts, the one from 1843 and 1850, the Millerite charts, because it illustrates the question we're asking, what is measuring time? It's important to really get a clear picture of this before we go too far into debating and drawing a line in the sand. So, as we look at what is measuring time, today we're going to look at what are the definitions of measuring, and what does it say in the Bible? What does it say? Just a little bit from Ellen White. There's probably a lot more she says, but just a little bit. And also we're going to look at the book Second Esdras. So, from Webster's Dictionary, 1828, we're going to look at least 20 different definitions of what it is to measure, and this will lead us to see how wide this topic is, and it's not as narrow as some of us try to make it out to be. So, to measure is as a participle of meteor, to measure or to meet. Number one, the whole extent or dimension of a thing, including length, breadth, and thickness. Examples are, the measure thereof is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. That's from Job 11:9. It is applied also to length or to breadth separately. So that's a long ways from the however high and however wide the earth is. Number two, that is, by what extent or dimension is ascertained, either length, breadth, thickness, capacity, or amount, as a rod or pole is a measure of 5 yards and a half, an inch, a foot, a yard are measures of length. A gallon is a measure of capacity. Weights and measures should be uniform. Silver and gold are the common measure of value. So, number three, a limited or definite quantity, as in a measure of wine or beer. They have specific type of measures they use for that. Number four, a determined extent or length, a limit. Lord, make me know my end and the measure of my days. Psalms 39, verse 4. 5. A rule by which anything is adjusted or proportioned. So an example is, there's a saying that God's goodness is the measure of his providence. Number 6. Proportion. Quantity is settled. I entered not into the particulars of the law of nature or its measures of punishment, yet there is such a law. Number 7, full or sufficient quantity. Example, I'll never pause again, till death hath closed these eyes of mine, or fortune given me measure of revenge. Number 8, extent of power or office. We will not boast of things without our measure. And that's from 2 Corinthians 10, verse 13. Number 9, a portion is allotted, an extent of ability, if else thou seekest aught not surpassing human measure, say. So there's various ways this can be defined. Number 10, a degree, or quantity indefinite. I have laid down in some measure the description of the old world. A great measure of discretion is to be used in the performance of confession. Those are two examples. Number 11, in music, that division by which the motion of music is regulated, or the interval or space of time between the rising and falling of the hand or foot of him who beats time. This measure regulates the time of dwelling on each note. The ordinary or common measure is 1 second. So anyone who's played music, whether it's drums, percussion, or piano, for example, which is also a percussive instrument, understands what this means. Most of us don't think in those terms until we get involved in music. Number 12, in poetry, the measure or meter is the manner of ordering and combining the quantities or the long and short syllables. Thus, in poetry, in other words, there's these things that are in poetry: hexameter, pentameter, lambic, sapphic verses, etc., consist of different measures. And by the way, in poetry and in music, there's a whole different way of doing meter and the motion of music in different styles of music in different cultures, including Persian music is very complicated. Music in the Middle East, but it's very beautiful. So there are many ways of looking at this that are beyond what most think in the Western world. Number 13, in dancing, the interval between steps corresponding to the interval between notes in the music. An example, my legs can keep no measure in delight. Number 14, in geometry, any quantity assumed as one or unity to which the ratio of other homogeneous or similar quantities is expressed. Geometry is an interesting class to take. I never thought I would like it till I took it. So number 15, a means to the end, an act, step, or proceeding toward the accomplishment of an object. An extensive signification of the word that's applicable to almost every act preparatory to a final end, and by which it is to be obtained or attained. Thus we speak of legislative measures, political measures, public measures, prudent measures, a rash measure, effectual measure, and inefficient measures. Sounds like those terms could be applicable to what's going on in the political system all around us this last year. So, in measure without moderation, with excess. So we can look at it, are we measuring with moderation or are we measuring with excess? Or for that matter, are we measuring very restrictively? Without measure, without limits, very largely or copiously. To have hard measure, to be harshly or oppressively treated. Linear or long measure, measure of length, the measure of lines or distances, or liquid measure, the measure of liquors. So there you have it, 15. Now we're going to go to a different type of measure definition. To compute or ascertain extent, quantity, dimensions, or capacity by a certain rule, as to measure land, to measure distance, to measure the altitude of a mountain, to measure the capacity of a ship or of a cask. I recently saw someone show a picture of a ship that used to be owned by a famous person, and then they died, and it just kind of went to nothing. All their wealth went to nothing, and the ship was just huge. It had a huge capacity. Okay, number 1, to ascertain the degree of anything as to measures the degree of heat or of moisture. That gets complicated for anyone that deals with weather and understands that more than I do. Number 2, to pass through or over. In other words, we must measure 20 miles today. or the vessel plows the sea, or and measures back with speed her former way. Lots to think about there. And we think of this differently now compared to 100 years ago, when 20 miles a day would be like by horse, not at all by foot, and certainly there were no cars, or very few. Okay, number 3. To judge of distance, extent, or quantity, as to measure anything by the eye. Great are thy works, Jehovah, infinite. That's the saying, and that makes a lot of sense to me when I think about this topic. Thy power, what thought can measure thee? When you really think about it, it's awesome to know all these things about numbers and scientific information, but it just shows how finite we are and how infinite is God. Number 4, to adjust to proportion. To secure a contented spirit, measure your desires by your fortunes, not your fortunes by your desires. Okay, that would be wise to do. Number 5, to allot or distribute by measure is another example. So the quote from the Bible is, with what measure ye meet, it shall be measured to you again, from Matthew 7, verse 2. So, another one here. Measured, computed or ascertained by a rule, adjusted, proportioned, and passed over. An example is equal, uniform, steady. In other words, he walked with measured steps. Measureless, without measure, unlimited, immeasurable. Measurement, the act of measuring. Mensuration. Never thought of that word being applied to a measurement before, but there it is. Measurer, one who measures, one whose occupation or duty is to measure commodities in market. That's a whole job category for some people. Measuring, computing or ascertaining length, dimensions, capacity, or amount. An example is a measuring cast, a throw or cast that requires to be measured or not to be measured by another, but by measuring. There were specific things that are used in different types of measuring, like when they measure how deep a well is, for example, or they measure how deep the ocean is, and they're measuring by sound versus other instruments. So there you see. There's a lot of different things that we use measuring for. So, having looked at that, I'm going to come to the King James Bible, and we're going to look at a few examples of this, and we are going to consider how that applies to measuring time. Okay? So Job, verse 11, or chapter 11, verses 7 through 9. Canst thou by searching find out God? Canst thou find out the Almighty unto perfection? It is as high as heaven. What canst you know? Deeper than hell. What can you know? The measure thereof is longer than the earth, and broader than the sea. And then Psalms 39, verse 4. Lord, make me to know mine end, and the measure of my days, what it is, that I may know how frail I am. Man is finite and God is infinite. That's one thing that we all should learn from studying this. And as we look on measuring time, we should always remember God is infinite and man is finite. God is immortal, man is mortal. So, coming to 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. For we dare not make ourselves of the number, or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves, but they, measuring themselves by themselves, are comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. So those who measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves among themselves are not wise. Verse 13, but we will not boast of things without our measure, but according to the measure of the rule which God hath distributed to us, a measure to reach, even unto you. So it's very important that we learn to measure things by God's rule and what God has given to us. For there are so many things beyond our imagination. So many things that are far deeper than most of us are aware of. And the rule that God has distributed includes that He gives to each of us a measure that reaches even unto each one of us in His mercy. So in the same chapter, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5, gives us some of the context of why the previous verses were there. And so I'm going to read it, and I want us to think about it. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. This is how we measure ourselves in God's Word, by fighting this battle through the knowledge and power of Christ and obedience to Christ. Otherwise, we're going to end up measuring ourselves by others and measuring ourselves by ourselves, and that's futile. So, coming to Matthew chapter 7, and verse 2 was quoted in application to from Webster's dictionary, but let's look at the whole thing in context. Starting with verse 1, judge not that ye be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with what measure you mete or measure, it shall be measured to you again. And why do you behold the mote that is in your brother's eye, but consider not the beam that is in your own eye? Or how will you say to your brother, let me pull out the mote out of your eye, and behold, a beam is in your own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of your own eye, and then shall you see clearly to cast out the mote out of your brother's eye. So, to have the correct measuring on anything, we need to make sure that the log has been taken out of our eye before we start measuring, whether it's another person or situation, or as we come to the Bible and we're reading and studying the Bible. So, Isaiah chapter 27, verses 8 and 9. In measure, when it shooteth forth, thou wilt debate with it. He stayeth his rough wind in the day of the east wind. By this, therefore, shall the iniquity of Jacob be purged, and this is all the fruit to take away his sin, when he maketh all the stones of the altar as chalk stones that are beaten in sunder, the groves and images shall not stand up. That last part of the verse reminds me of the image in Daniel, where the stone came and the image was destroyed from the foot on, from the bottom, the feet on down, were destroyed and made into basically dust. So when you look at this, when the message is given with the east wind, and there's a lot of good studies on that having to do with the third wall of Islam and all kinds of things, but when the message is given with the east wind, God's people will be a people who measure. And the prayer that we should have is that God will grant that we will not debate against this message that comes during the time of the east wind. So we're going to come to looking at when did time actually begin. So then, and measuring time. So Genesis 1 verse 14, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. God gave to us signs, seasons, days, and years in the beginning of creation. And then there were things that changed. So let's just keep reading. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the next verse says, and the evening and the morning were the fourth day. So, times and seasons, days and years. Now let's read a couple of quotes from Ellen White about when our awareness of how to measure time began. Our first parents learned these things before sin. The laws and operations of nature, which have engaged men's study for the 6,000 years, were opened to their minds by the infinite framer and upholder of all. That's our Creator, God, Jesus. They held converse with leaf and flower and tree, gathering from each the secrets of its life. With every living creature, from the mighty Leviathan, that's a huge whale-like animal, from the mighty Leviathan that played among the waters to the insect mote that floats in the sunbeam, Adam was familiar. He had given to each its name, and he was acquainted with the nature and habits of all. He had the knowledge of all of this, and so did Eve. God's glory in the heavens, the innumerable worlds in their orderly revolutions, were the balancing of the clouds. Orderly revolutions and the balancing of the clouds. The mysteries of light and sound, of day and night, all were open to the study of our first parents. On every leaf of the forest or stone of the mountains, in every shining star, in earth and air and sky, God's name was written. The order and harmony of creation spoke to them of infinite wisdom and power. They were ever discovering some attraction that filled their hearts with deeper love and called forth fresh expressions of gratitude. In other words, as Adam and Eve studied these things and became aware of all of this, it filled their hearts with deeper love. That's what all this knowledge and measuring this knowledge is meant to do, is to fill our hearts with deeper love and give us gratitude, fresh expressions of gratitude to our Creator. So long as they remained loyal to the divine law, their capacity to know, to enjoy, and to love would continually increase. They would be constantly obtaining new treasures of knowledge, discovering fresh springs of happiness, and obtaining a clearer and yet clearer conceptions of the immeasurable, unfailing love of God. God's love is immeasurable. We may measure time or gain some understanding of that, but God's love is immeasurable. Can you just think of it? And when this awareness and ability to do this will be given back to mankind in the new earth. So this is how it was for Adam and Eve, but something changed. So back up. These quotes are from Patriarchs and Prophets, page 50 and 51, paragraph 3 through paragraph 1. So Patriarchs and Prophets, page 57, paragraph 1. After his transgression, Adam at first imagined himself entering upon a higher state of existence. Sounds like how people feel when they have their first drink or their first getting high. So Adam at first imagined himself entering upon a higher state of existence, but soon the thought of his sin filled him with terror. The air, which had hitherto been of a mild and uniform temperature, seemed to chill the guilty pair. The love and peace which had been theirs was gone, and in its place they felt a sense of sin, a dread of the future, a nakedness of soul. The robe of light which had enshrouded them now disappeared. The robe of light which had enshrouded them now disappeared. We can search from Genesis on through the Bible and find examples of where this is directly stated. So the robe of light disappeared, and to supply its place, they endeavored to fashion for themselves a covering. This was a covering of skin when you read in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. For they could not, while unclothed, meet the eye of God and holy angels. So, the lesson to learn from this is we need the covering of Christ's righteousness. They lost a lot by losing that robe of light covering them. They still had a lot of the knowledge. In fact, Cain, when he killed his brother, and later Cain's descendant, Lamech, who killed his brother, or killed a man, they all got the 7 times, and they understood that. And Cain even heard God tell him that. But sin totally destroyed what was going on in their lives and the lives of their descendants. So here's an example of what happened with this knowledge and a group of people who had this knowledge. In the time of David, there were still people who understood the times and used that knowledge to know what Israel ought to do. And in 1 Chronicles 12, verse 32, there's an example of David numbering the men who joined him in his army to fight in a war. The total number of those men were 339,600 men. Okay? And so in 1 Chronicles 12, verse 32, it says, "And of the children of Issachar, which were men that had understanding of the times, to know what Israel ought to do, the heads of them were 200, and all their brethren were at their commandment." They could tell by understanding the times what to tell Israel to do. Now, these were 200 men. Mathematically, they amounted to 5% of the total army, 339,600 men in David's army. And they understood that. Okay, Daniel 9, verse 1. "In the year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans." And then in verse 2, "In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years, whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem." So this first group in David's time understood about the times. Daniel understood the number of the years by reading the books in Jeremiah's prophecy. So he understood that there were 70 years for the desolations of Jerusalem and Babylon, and that those 70 years were ending. So in verse 3, "And I set my face unto the Lord God, to seek by prayer and supplication, with fasting and sackcloth and ashes." So we're coming to now, and these are just briefly going over some of the verses in the Bible. There's a lot more verses, but I just want to get everyone to thinking about this as you study. When we read Ellen White's 2 visions that were given, that were about the Apocrypha, those visions, one was on September 23, 1849. The other one was on January 11, 1850. And some people have changed the date a bit to being January 26 or 28, but it really was January 11 from what I can tell. Anyway, from those 2 visions, here's a quote. "Taking the large Bible containing the Apocrypha," so she was in vision with the first vision, and she held the large Bible up, heavy Bible, and it had the Apocrypha in it. And later on, there were 3 women at that vision who actually signed a paper that to verify that they had witnessed this, and that and this particular Bible Apocrypha was there, and there's conflicting information on that when you look at it. But anyway, here's the quote: "Pure and undefiled, a part of it is consumed. Holy, holy, walk carefully. Tempted, the word of God, take it, Marion stole." This was one of the women there. "Bind it long upon thine heart, pure and unadulterated. How lovely, how lovely, how lovely. My blood, my blood, my blood. Oh, the children of disobedience, reproved, reproved. Thy word, thy word, thy word. A part of it is burned unadulterated. A part of the hidden book. A part of it is burned, the Apocrypha." The Apocrypha is the hidden book. Okay. So this is just part of that vision. And this is a quote that is from the second vision on January 11, 1850. "I then saw the word of God pure and unadulterated, and that we must answer for the way we received the truth proclaimed from that word. I saw that it had been a hammer to break the flinty heart in pieces, and a fire to consume the dross in tin, that the heart might be pure and holy. I saw that the Apocrypha was the hidden book, and that the wise of these last days should understand it. I saw that the Bible was the standard book that will judge us at the last day. I saw that heaven would be cheap enough, and that nothing was too dear to sacrifice for Jesus, and that we must give all to enter the kingdom. I heard an angel say, Think ye that God will place his seal where there is an idol? No, no." So this is part of the second vision. She clarifies the Apocrypha was a hidden book, and the wise of the last days should understand it. If you want to study further, there's several studies about this, going into great detail with both of those visions and, what I found in studying it out. So let's come to some conclusions I have for this study with that. I believe the wise of the last days will know and understand a message that Satan has attempted to portray as defile. He has attempted to defile that message and to make it impure and to destroy and to consume that message by burning it as if it was trash. Number 2, I believe the wise of the last days will recognize the part of the message that is pure, unadulterated, a part of what is called by many Apocrypha, but it is really a part of God's jewels. Number 3,